All right. Well, it's one afternoon, so we have lots to talk about. So let's get going. This is, if you can believe it, this is our 36th monthly webinar. We've been doing this for 3 years now, and I think we might have skipped 1 month for some reason or other. I can't remember. Might have been for the holidays. But when I reflect on the fact that we've been doing this for that long, it's kind of amazing. Hi, Aaron. So this topic is, what does good look like, which sounds perhaps kind of funny, but I have to give credit to a longtime colleague of mine, and that is Ann Cazares. And if she's not seeing this now, but if she sees this live, she'll probably be surprised to see her picture here. But Ann was one of our first certified performance thinking practitioners, actually. Six boxes practitioner, we called them in those time, at that time. And Ann she was at a company called Amerigroup at the time in 2010. And she brought us in for herself and the whole team of people that she was leading there. And she's proceeded to a very senior role at Anthem up until a short time ago, and now she's at Kaiser Permanente. But something that Ann said to me recently when we were speaking, she said, I can't tell you how many times in a day I ask people, what does good look like? So this was a little bit of a inspiration for doing this particular topic. Now, before we get into it, I just want to remind you that we do record these webinars and we put them on YouTube, and you can get there at www.performancethinking.tv. And in addition to the webinars, there's also some short videos and presentations over time that we've sort of collected and posted. And you can also, we have begun, and we've had a bit of a pause recently because we're still sort of in limbo between our offices, which we closed at the end of May when we went all virtual, in our new building that is in the process of getting constructed. So we're sort of up in the air about a lot of things right now, but we do have some free study guides for these webinars that some people have found useful for study groups for themselves, just to get more out of it. So if you want to sign up for those, you can use that QR code. And of course, if you are watching this live, recorded, as some people will on YouTube, please subscribe, please like us, please share this, pass it on to your colleagues, because we think there's a lot of valuable content here, not just for people who already know about performance thinking, and I see a bunch of you are in that category, but also if you have stakeholders, if you have colleagues, if people that you're trying to introduce either outside of your organization or inside of your organization. If you look at the full range of webinars that are on the channel right now, you'll find some things that will probably be relevant to you to help communicate, that people can watch on their own, or for that matter, you don't have to watch all the visuals. You can run this on your phone while you're driving and listen to it, and it won't be a bad podcast. So we encourage you to sort of let people know about the YouTube channel. We've got a bunch more webinars coming up as usual. The next one, as I'll talk about in a minute, is going to trace our work back to B.F. Skinner's Natural Science of Behavior. And so that's upcoming. And then we want to revisit sales enablement. One of the things that we've frankly been amazed by in recent years, as we've brought back some of our expertise that we developed over several decades to the sales enablement field, is that there are very few organizations that have actually defined their sales process precisely in terms of the milestones in that sales process that traditional sales training people call advances. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to, again, revisit a topic in some more depth about how design thinking, which really was introduced to us in many respects by our colleague Surya Vanka some years ago at our Summer Institute, and performance engineering, which is what we do essentially, how those combine, how performance improvement really is a design engineering discipline. And then at some point, we're going to talk about leadership and management, because our programs have been more and more of interest to organizations trying to develop their leaders and managers, and we kind of want to take a fresh look at that. So the upcoming one, we're going to skip November, I should mention, and for a lot of reasons. One of them is to sort of take a breather after 3 years straight. But one of them is I'm going to be on the road for about 3 weeks in November at a conference, at the memorial for one of my great mentors, Henry Pennypacker, and doing some work at West Florida, the University of West Florida, recording some continuing education videos for our colleagues in the behavioral, essentially applied behavior analysis world. So I'm going to be on the road from one hotel room to another, and I thought it made sense to take a little bit of a breather. But in December, we're going to have this one. And this will be a description both at a sort of a personal level, because all of those people that you could see other than me were my mentors and teachers. And there's also been an evolution over, frankly, almost 15 years from B.F. Skinner's Natural Science of Behavior, which I'm going to try to be really clear about what that means when we say natural science, through all of these people to me. And so there's a personal history here, but more importantly, there's a conceptual and scientific history that we want to talk about. And we think it's of interest potentially both to sort of scholars and researchers, of whom there are some people that tend to engage with these webinars, but also if you're in an organization that wants to bring in evidence-based practices or science-based practices, this is one. And I want to show you how that is true. So that's what we're doing in December. So today, we're going to have an agenda which really is pretty simple. I want to talk a little bit that pretty much everybody in this list that I can see right now knows about already, so we'll make it quick. But basically to overview, if you will, how we got to accomplishment-based performance improvement. And then how our work evolved over the years, particularly with respect to this issue of defining what we call criteria for good work outputs. And then why and how we do that and how that's evolved. And then there's a whole bunch of advantages to this. And many of you, because some of you are practitioners, know about this, but there's some pretty significant advantages to defining criteria for what a good accomplishment is. And then we'll see if we have some discussion. I'd love it if people would interact a bit on the chat box, but you never know. So let's talk a little bit about accomplishment-based performance improvement. And most of you are aware probably that at least for us, that anchors back or goes back to Dr. Tom Gilbert. And Gilbert was, originally a instructional technology guy. And he actually was for a short time a postdoc with B.F. Skinner. He participated in the Office of Programmed Instruction back in the 60s. But he really was an important contributor, along with Gary Rumler and several others, to the shift from instructional technology or instructional systems, as they often called it, to performance systems, performance technology. And again, most of you probably know this book, but it's still taught in graduate programs around the world, Human Competence. That's my old beat up 1978 version. But in it, he said this really groundbreaking thing. He said, in the great cult of behavior, he called it, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. And if you think about it, if you reflect on what we now can observe in the talent development, training, management, leadership world, people either implicitly or explicitly are always talking about behavior. And one of the sort of buzz phrases this year for talent development is skills-based this and that. Well, skills-based really means behavior-based. It's what people can do. But what Gilbert pointed out was that that's not what's valuable. What's valuable is, as he said, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. And while not everyone in the field took that to heart, the field of human performance technology evolved to a great extent based on this notion that we should sort of anchor our analysis of performance to accomplishments, what he called accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. So that was a huge paradigm shift that really led to the work that we do. And I think this formula that he had is a very nice kind of simple explication of this. Because if you think about any intervention you might make to improve performance, whether it's training or coaching or implementing a new system or redesigning a process or whatever it is, the worth of that intervention is going to be equal to the value of the accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior that it produces, divided by the cost to support the behavior. So, to support behavior, we hire people, we train them, we give them tools, we engage them in all kinds of ways. And then we expect them to produce value for our organizations or for the society. And of course, these days, people talk about that as return on investment. And so if you're going to really do ROI, and a lot of people talk about ROI, you ought to be focusing on the valuable products that people produce, because that's going to be the value in the equation. And this, at a minimum, conceptually, even if you don't take this as a kind of a spreadsheet exercise, even if you just take it as a conceptual perspective, it focuses you on what are people producing? What is actually the valuable products of their behavior? Now, I started using this little example some years ago when my longtime colleague, Brett DeNovi, who has built and leads a still growing, rather large behavioral health company. And he was saying, after we'd introduced this notion of focusing on accomplishments to him, because he's a hardcore behaviorist, he said, well, tell me more about what it is about this accomplishments thing that's important. And I just asked him, I said, Brett, have you ever been in a meeting that failed to produce any valuable accomplishments? It didn't produce anything of value, where you got to the end of it, it's like, oops, well, I guess our time is up. We'll have to meet again. That's the question. When you are having a meeting, does it produce decisions, agreements, next steps, plans? What does that meeting produce of value? Relationships, even. Those are all things that are valuable potentially. And so to me, this is a microcosm for this notion that whatever it is we're looking at in terms of performance, we need to focus on what does the behavior produce of value? So that's kind of the really quick and dirty notion about why we focus on accomplishments and sort of where this accomplishment-based approach came from. And of course, there's a lot more detail, and some of you that are here in the group know this. For example, Joe Harless, who was a student and protege of Tom Gilbert, really systematized accomplishment-based curriculum development in particular, but also performance analysis. What I want to do is, though, taking off from that, is talk a little bit, again, many of you know this, about how we evolved from 1982, when I first encountered Tom Gilbert in his work and he began to mentor me and so forth, to now. How has that all evolved? Now, I always claim, and most of you probably have seen this if you've ever seen a presentation by me, I always claim significant influence by Steve Jobs. And that's partly because Ogden Lindsley turned me on to Steve Jobs in the in the late 70s, when the Apple II first happened. And I was a fanboy for all of Jobs' life. But this book had a big impact on me. Ken Segall, who worked with Jobs, talked about how Steve Jobs brought simplicity to everything that they did at Apple and also at Next Computer. And simplicity comes in various forms, but some of it also, influenced by Ogden Lindsley, is in the language you use as well. And so I've been sort of in search of simplicity for most of my career. And one of the things we did as we encountered accomplishment-based performance improvement, and especially as I got deeply involved in it in the 80s, I began to notice that a lot of our colleagues who talked about accomplishments or wrote about them in publications had pretty wildly different definitions of what an accomplishment was. Sometimes they would talk about giant sort of organizational level things, a successful department or something like that. And sometimes there was talking about very small things like deliverables. And the word accomplishment is a great sort of compelling word. It sounds important, it's valuable and all that. But when you look at the literature, it's kind of a mess. It's kind of a confusion. So rather than trying to teach people what we mean by accomplishments, we probably, it's been at least 15, maybe 20 years ago now, coined this phrase work outputs. And it's obviously more appropriate in the world of work than it is in other environments, although my children's mother and I actually applied an accomplishment-based approach with our sons, and our family. But work outputs imply two things. First of all, that the product of something, in this case, work, but also notice it's plural. So these are things, and that's what we always point out. A work output is a thing. It's a countable noun. So any of you who've been through our programs know this, but I think it's a big deal. And I think if there's one technical contribution that I might have made to the field of performance improvement, it might be this thing. Because if you define accomplishments in ways that are not countable things, not countable nouns, like information or advice, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know, like, my silly statement is always, does that come in a hose or buckets? Like, how do we measure it? So it needs to be countable. If we're going to apply natural science measures to things, there needs to be an ability to have it be countable. So this is an example of countable nouns, the products of a vice president. And you can see that the vice president's in the middle, and the outputs are delivered to the various customers around the side. So you can define jobs in this way. You can also look at processes this way. And again, anybody who's been through our programs know this, that processes are steps that people typically use to define processes, but each step produces a thing. So performance has, if it's valuable, is behavior that contributes outputs or accomplishments. And so this is how we think about it. I often find that sports analogies work extremely well. And so what we often say is that human performance is behavior producing work outputs that contribute to business results. And in thinking about it that way, we can fairly readily figure out what the value is. So sports is a good way to think about this, or good examples. So this is our famous soccer girl, and she's behaving. She's kicking the football, or the soccer ball. Football, as you would say any place but the United States, I think. And her output is what? It's a goal. It's the ball in the net. And why do we care about that? Because it contributes to organizational or societal, or in this case, team results, which is the score and winning the game. So that's a way to think about it. And the way we have approached this is with our simple model, the performance chain. And so we use this model to describe performance, what we would call the units of analysis. So it's behavior that produces work outputs or accomplishments that contribute to business or societal results. And of course, there are all the things that influence that, and we're not going to really speak about that this time much. That's where we use the 6 boxes model. But those elements of behavior producing work outputs that contribute to results are sort of the heart of analysis. And of course, we focus on work outputs. And you can see we have this phrase, criteria for good, or sometimes we say criteria for a good one. And so that gets to the heart of the matter for this webinar, because the question is, why and how do we define criteria for good? What is the point of that? What does it mean in our work? Now, here's an example of a whole bunch of different outputs from a bunch of different kinds of people, from different jobs and so forth. So, we can talk about the product of a factory process, like, a complete machine or something that's produced at the end of a manufacturing process. Or we can talk about the parts in that process. But we want to know what a good one is. And typically in process, there's things called defects, which are outputs that don't meet criteria in one way or the other. But there's lots of other things too, like a funding decision. What is a good funding decision? What characterizes a good one versus not so good one? What about a relationship? If you think about the relationships you might have with your colleagues, with the people that report to you, with the people to whom you report, what are the characteristics of a good working relationship that make it good? And if some of your relationships are not so good, then what would you do to enable them to meet those criteria for goodness? Or a sales proposal. This is one we worked on. I see John Skank has joined us. And back decades ago, when I was working with him, when he was Senior Vice President of Sales at Dun & Bradstreet, one of the things we did is we worked on sales proposals, and we tried to define what is a good one, other than what you know after the fact, which is it sold the deal. But before you submit it to your prospect, to your customer, how do we define what a good one is? Or response to an inquiry, if you're a customer service person, it needs to be clear, it needs to be actionable, etc. A product prototype. If it's a prototype, does it need to be new and different from other things? What makes a good one? People talk about successful trainees. Well, is that just somebody who sat in the training seat for all day or all week or during the modules? Or is there something else we can say about, like, for example, a trainee who can actually accomplish or produce something successfully at the end? Feedbacks. Lots of people have worked on feedback and teaching managers and leaders how to give feedback, but what constitutes an instance of a good feedback or a good goal, for that matter, and so forth? You can go down this list, and every single one of these things, you might ask, what comprises a good one? Why should, what's one we should care about versus one we should reject or try to improve? Now, in the very beginning of this work, when I got involved in it at first, we used to just use adjectives, and some of them were rather imprecise, like a good working relationship begs the question. I still don't know what a good one is. But, clear, accurate, timely, that's starting to get in the right direction. Although hard to know what timely means. Does it mean by the end of the day? Does it mean by next week? We better get more precise than that. Or, for example, a product prototype. Novel, okay, so we want new stuff. Easy to manufacture, depending on how we define that. Profitable or profitably priced, that's getting there. Successful training, what does that mean? Effective feedback, good. So the point is, we used to use adjectives, and we would wind up saying, well, that's not very concrete. And so we would string all these adjectives together. And then probably almost 20 years ago, at least 15 years ago, we began using what we now call a multi-table to get rid of this problem, that there's either just all these words listed or that it's not clear enough to be actionable. And so we started these tables, and we now, as those of you who've been through our practitioner performance consulting program know, we have a thing called a multi-table, which is basically a spreadsheet that has a whole bunch of columns, and these are some of the columns. So we define who is the performer, what is the work output, we name it, we define the customer to whom it's delivered and the business results that we hope will contribute to, and then we try very hard to define criteria so that if we look at the sales proposal, the working relationship, or the mowed lawn, or whatever it is, we can tell if we got a good one or not, and we can agree whether we have a good one or not. So that's where we've gone over quite a few years, and it's pretty obvious once you look at it. But not everybody goes in that direction. Not everybody gets that precise, and this is an area of precision that we've tried to focus in on. Now, the thing that's interesting about it is when people see our models and they see the simplicity of the performance chain and then of the 6 boxes model, there's a tendency for people to say, oh, piece of cake, I can do that. Now, as everyone who's almost probably the hundreds of people who have ever been through our programs will say, identifying work outputs is a lot harder than we thought. You can define widgets and deliverables, but there's a lot of less tangible ones like relationships, decisions, approvals, etc., which are a little bit harder to even know how to define sometimes. And defining criteria is even harder, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But this is really the hard part. Now, one of the things that's important to emphasize, and one of the things that's hard about it, is that very often when I ask people, or when we ask people to define the criteria for work output, they'll start telling you about, well, it needs to be produced following the standard operating procedures or whatever. And my response to that is, well, okay, that's important behavior, but that doesn't define what a good output is. I need to be able to look at the thing itself, either literally tangibly on the table or in my hand or wherever it is, or to have somebody describe it to me like a decision. And I need to be able to determine, analyzing the thing itself, the work output itself, whether it's a good one or not. So how it was produced is, of course, relevant, but that's behavior, and that's not criteria for a good output. This is kind of reminiscent of what Gilbert used to say, which is that accomplishments or work outputs you leave behind, and you can look at those and so forth. Behavior you take with you. So if the VP comes into your office and makes a decision, that decision is left behind, and then the VP takes off to lunch, and the behavior goes with her. But the thing itself is the product. And the other thing that gets very difficult sometimes for people is that the second bit there, which is people start saying, well, must includes, this, that, and the other thing. And a lot of times they're talking about documents, things like proposals or reports or budgets or whatever it is. They're talking about sections of a document. And as I'll point out, that doesn't work either, because those sub-outputs are either separate outputs worth calling out themselves, or what we tend to do is to put them in a template, which I can explain that in a few minutes. Now, one thing that's an exception to this thing about behavior is there are certain kinds of work outputs, and the most obvious examples are relationship between two people, like relationship between two engineering managers, or between a direct report and her manager, or whatever. Those things actually are defined to some extent by the behavior that's characteristic of them. And similarly, if we say at the end of training, for example, a person who can now produce a good budget, let's say that's what we trained them to build, design and develop a budget for departments the way we do it around here. Well, very often a person who, as an output of training or management, behavior is characteristic of that. But notice the behavior is characteristic of the thing. It's not how you produce the thing. And there's a difference. So to get back to this topic about sub-outputs, we approach this in one of two ways. And very, very often, this is where documents are involved. So the thing on the right there is just the cover page of a proposal. And it happens to be a proposal probably I wrote or somebody in my company wrote a few years ago. And it's been sanitized, of course. But that's the table of contents. And what you notice on the table of contents is there's sections in there. And the background is going to be real different from proposed solutions, from the description of the process, from the phases in the project. And so if I were going to say, what is a good discussion proposal coming from our company, I would want to do one of two things. I'd either want to have a separate list of all those sections in it, in my table, or in however I'm summarizing my analysis, with criteria for each one. What is a good background? What is the section? What we've learned so far? What's included in there, et cetera, and what is a good one? Or more likely, for documents, it's usually easier to say, if it's a kind of standard document, whether it's like a budget or a certain kind of report or proposal or whatever that happens more than once and is worth standardizing, it's then useful to have a template or a model or a job aid. So you can say a good discussion proposal includes all the sections that we've defined in the model job aid and meets the criteria in that job aid. And that makes it simpler to just point to a tool or a reference document that has all the criteria listed in it. On the other hand, sometimes when people start defining sections or parts of work outputs, maybe you want to pull those sections out separately and have separate criteria for them. But don't just say a good one includes the following sections, because it really sort of just kicks the can down the road, if you will. And so criteria should not include statements like includes X, Y, and Z, because those are sub-outputs. So that's a thing that people have a hard time remembering, but it makes a difference. Now, so when we think about what makes for a good one, and again, we're talking about accomplishments or outputs. First thing is, what does it have to be in order to contribute to business results in the way that we want it to be? And my standard example of that is a sales proposal. If I'm trying to, if my business result is market share, I want to expand market share, I might be willing to sell my products or services at a loss, or at least not profitably. And so maybe the proposal doesn't have to be profitably priced. Although in most sales situations, if a proposal is involved, one of the key criteria from a business results point of view is going to be profitably priced. And you can look at that in a lot of other contexts too, where there are business results that have implications for what a good one of the thing is. And then another way to think about, or another thing to consider when you're defining criteria, is what are the customer requirements? What does this have to be for the customer? So, for example, when I was running a company where we did a lot of documentation for sales and marketing organizations, we would have revision cycles. And so good edits from our clients had to be specific, actionable, legible, and so forth, because we were the customers. We were the users of those edits. And if they didn't meet those criteria, we couldn't use them. Or, for example, if we've got, one of the examples I sometimes use in our training programs is a flashlight for a scuba diver. Well, if the customer is a scuba diver, we need the flashlight to be waterproof. We maybe need it to have some way to attach itself to the belt or to the things that the scuba diver is wearing. And we probably need it to be bright enough to, penetrate murky water. And maybe we have to have it, of a certain weight, within a weight framework. So we can define, based on the user, the customer, their needs or their preferences, what a good one is. And sometimes there's even cultural values that help us define what a good one is. One of my favorite real examples from a client was years ago. We were working with a logistics company, and this was a company that basically managed the supply chains for big organizations. So they would be shipping stuff around the world by trains, planes, boats, trucks, and so forth. And so they had a strong value for their company called fairness to customers. They wanted to do everything they could to be perceived as and to actually be as fair to customers as they could be. That was a cultural value there. And they made a big deal of it. And one of the outputs where that was relevant was what they called a pricing agreement. And a good pricing agreement, from their perspective, to sort of manifest that value, was as low a price as we can make it for our clients, but still maintaining a certain percent of profit for us. So it was a complex spreadsheet, basically, and they tried to optimize it so the client would get the best possible deal, but the company, would still make some profit margin on it. And that was a commitment to that value because they viewed it as likely to get return business and likely to project an image of truly fair to customers kind of company. And sometimes, and this last bullet I'll go into a little bit more, but sometimes you look at a set of output and you can't really come up with the criteria. What is a good one of these? What is a good one of a monthly report, or a sales proposal, or what have you, or a plan of some kind that we do very often? Well, you can sometimes do that in a different way, which is that you can find some ones that everybody considers to be good and find some ones that people consider to be not so good and put them in separate clusters and look at what the differences are. And you can often discover stuff like, oh, well, the good ones the ones that everybody likes has more white space, or uses more graphics to convey information, or uses active voice sentences rather than long sentences that have, complicated language in it. You may be able to look at examples, and things that you wouldn't have thought of before float to the surface. Oh, that's what distinguishes a good one from a not so good one. So that's what we sometimes call an inductive approach to doing that. Now, a big thing about criteria is that the whole point is that they're easy to agree on. So if we come up with a set of criteria and you and I look at the thing and we're going to argue whether the criteria apply, that didn't cut it. That didn't work. So, my whipping boy on that one is timely. It's not good enough, because I might mean by the end of the day and you might mean by the end of the week. Now, we can get around that in some cases by saying things like by agreed upon time. But still, if we don't have criteria that you and I can very quickly check off and say, yep, that meets it or not, then it defeats the whole purpose. And it's not always perfect, as the third bullet there says, but we try very hard to make criteria as concrete and actionable and easy to agree on whether they apply or not. So, and as I pointed out earlier, doing this is sometimes harder actually than identifying the work outputs themselves in the first place. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of how our thinking about what good looks like has evolved. And so I'm just going to go through a long list and make some comments about them. And then I hope other people will have some comments. So if you do a good job at this, if you take your outputs and define crisp criteria, first thing is sets expectations for everyone involved. You can, quote, be on the same page. Yep, we need that to be by X time. It has certain quality characteristics, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody involved can have expectations that are shared if criteria are crisp and clear. It also turns out to be a lot easier to connect people's behavior through work outputs to business results. Because, for example, if somebody is filling out some form and you're trying to say, this form you fill out every day may seem kind of trivial to you, but actually could have a big effect on our, on audits and our regulatory compliance or on customer satisfaction. And that's because it needs to be on time. It needs to be accurate information. It needs to be complete. So in other words, you describe the characteristics of the work outputs. And as you do so, people recognize, oh, I can see that. That connects up what I do to produce this thing. So I better produce it so that it meets, it really connects to those business results. It also defines value in an important way. Because a lot of times people, for example, a lot of people talk about training, and you ask them about outputs. They say, well, one of my outputs is training. I say, well, no, training is behavior. Training is activity. You can sit in the seats all day and be trained and not be able to produce or do a darn thing more than you could at the beginning of the day. So what is it that training or a meeting or any other activity produces that you delivers to the recipient of that? And so it helps to define the value. And since business or even non-business organizations are usually about delivering value, that's a helpful thing to do. Know where the value is, know how to measure the value, which is the next thing. If we have widgets coming off the end of the assembly line, but we don't really have a clear, crisp idea for what it means to be good. We don't know what the tolerances are, let's say, or we don't know, we don't know exactly how the paint is supposed to look or whatever it is. We don't have clear, crisp definitions of a good one. It's kind of hard for us to count the good ones and the not good ones. And the same thing applies to things like responses to questions in customer satisfaction or a good proposal or any number of other things. If we define the criteria, it allows us to count the ones that meet criteria and not to count the other ones. And it's a heck of a lot easier to measure outputs than it is to measure behavior or business results. And it's a pretty good leading indicator. So measurement is a very important aspect of what we're all talking about a lot of the time. But you can't define the outputs to count very well until you know what the criteria are. Of course, feedback. There was actually, we have, I think, a blog on, I think I wrote a blog a few years ago on our website about this topic. There was an article in Harvard Business Review about how difficult feedback can be and what a challenge it is for people. And it goes into a lot of the issues around giving people feedback for their behavior. And of course, it's important to give people feedback for their behavior. But actually, if you can look at the products of those behavior, whether it's the quality of the relationship that that person is trying to develop, or the widget that they're assembling, or the document, or the decision, or anything else, if we look at the thing and we have very crisp criteria for what a good one and not a good one is, then we can build our feedback. And in fact, even the performer herself or himself can determine, if they know the criteria, their own feedback. They can say, well, it did meet those criteria, good work, or it didn't. Let's see, what can we do to make it meet those criteria? So criteria for outputs strengthen and make it easier to provide feedback. And then, of course, if we know what the thing has to be, then we know what behavior is needed in many cases. So, if the edges of the widget need to be sort of filed down so they're smooth, then that implies a certain behavior. Or if the lug nuts are supposed to be tightened to a certain tightness, then we know what the behavior needs to be. It's like, get out your wrench and be sure it's tightened properly. Or if it's a document that has to have certain sections in it that read a certain way and that are easy to read and have active sentences and all that, then it's much easier to point out to people what they need to do and define the behavior for producing it. A lot of times there are tools that we create, and sometimes those tools might be, things like job aids and reference to documents. But if you're in the manufacturing world, or if you're in other sort of hands-on kind of worlds, or even software as a tool, when you know the criteria of the thing that you're trying to produce, it's very helpful in terms of defining what the tool needs to be to help you make that. And that's pretty obvious, but people don't think of it that way always. And this is why we focus, one of the many reasons we focus on criteria. Just as it makes it easier to measure outputs that are good and not so good, it makes it easier to recognize and reward it. It's like, look, you got a bunch of good ones today. That's fantastic, Of course, we follow Joe Harless's recommendation for accomplishment-based training. So our view at the Performance Thinking Network is that if your training objectives, instead of being the person will be able to do or will know X, Y, or Z, will be able to produce, whether it's a decision or a good description of a work output or an improved relationship or a team that works together, whatever it is, if we can take a training objective and make it a work output and then say what the criteria for good work output is, it's a lot more lean and focused for both the trainers and the trainees to get so they can produce those things. And the feedback and all the rest of it, the tools that you give people in training, they're all focused on producing the outputs that meet standards. And that's a lot easier than trying to get people to behave in a certain way based on form of the behavior. And then even during hiring, one of the things we often recommend is that if you define a job based on its accomplishments or the work outputs that job needs to produce, that will make it easier to both hire and onboard people, because you can define more crisply what the things are you expect them to produce. So if I'm interviewing somebody who's going to be a department manager, and I ask them, have you ever produced a strategic plan for a team or a department? And they start telling me that, I can ask some questions that focus in on, okay, did they have in mind the criteria that we use around here when we define such a plan? And they may or may not, but we can then understand the delta and understand how easily we can get them to that. And that would apply to anything else we would talk to them about if it involved accomplishments. So those are just some things. And those are just some of the things that are relevant. I'm gonna actually get rid of my face right now so that you can see this. But a question is in the chat box, and maybe I'm hoping there's still people here. The question is, what do you think? This is a long list of why we think well-defined criteria are important. Are there any comments from any of you folks? Because I know some people, I know Scott has got lots of experience in different environments that are related to this, and Holly and Johan and others. What do you guys think? Anything? Is this a conversation worth having, do you think, in your world? One of the things that that we've sort of found over the years is that when people, like I recall an example some years ago, it was in a bank we were working with, and there was a concern about sort of ill-defined jobs and people that seemed to have the same job title, but they seemed to be doing different stuff, and they were sort of stepping on each other's toes, and criteria made a difference. So Scott, good point. So yeah, Erwin and Scott, yeah, absolutely. So picture of the puzzle, the most challenging, but very interesting. Yeah, so Holly, so I'm curious. You've done a lot of stuff in all of this, work of performance thinking. I'm curious if there's examples where criteria made a difference in the work you've done, either as a coach and manager or when you've looked at processes. I think I could ask Johan the same thing. Yeah. Criteria defines what behaviors need. Absolutely. That's true. Yeah, Holly, that's what I think. If everybody is watching the chat box, one of the things that I was struck by, and it was a new idea for me when I read that article in Harvard Business Review. Like, people are having all these struggling giving people feedback on behavior, and you can do it. But when you say, okay, when the product that behavior meets criteria, yeah, I think you're right. I think that when you're able to define those criteria and clear expectations, we all like clear expectations, and I think this is the way to make it, make them clearer and stronger and more usable. Yeah, Johan, I think that's right, because we do need to give people feedback about behavior. And I think another implication of what you're saying about the notion of criteria defining behavior is you can often explain to people, like, even, for example, if you're trying to produce a happy customer in a customer service call, if that's one of your outputs, then there's things you can do to make them happier, not just solve their problem, but speak in a nice tone of voice and maybe make some jokes or whatever it takes to make them feel like the transaction was good and it was successful. And so sometimes the criteria will help direct people to even figure out what would make a difference. Yes, standards. I mean, Scott, that's the I think that's one of the obvious applications. And you being in a pretty a manufacturing-like environment, or people are looking at concrete stuff, standards have often been a way people talk about criteria. And I don't think it's a new idea, but I think it's a little bit new when you expand the notion of criteria beyond real concrete things. Because I think one place it's often used has been historically in processes where people are defining, what they're doing customer focus, and they're figuring out what the customer needs and what the thing needs to be and all that, which is fantastic. But we're sort of suggesting expanding that to any time when you're looking at performance and what the output is, even like decisions. If you think about decisions, usually the criteria for a good decision are the factors upon which that decision is made. When Pete Carroll, who's the coach of the Seattle Seahawks football team, when they select new people, new guys for their team, when they draft them, they're looking at characteristics of those people. They're looking at their values. They're looking at how, physical things like how fast they run and all that. And there's all characteristics of the person that determine whether they're going to try to get them on the team or not. Looking at John's thing, higher education students want to know what a good assignment. Yeah, no kidding. Well, that's a really good point, John. I'm seeing your point about we often assume people know what the output should look like. I'm not so good in that respect, because I move pretty quickly in most of what I'm doing, and I've so often noticed that I assume people can read my mind, and that's the problem with expectations in general, of course, but in particular, if you can define the standards of the criteria, it's a lot easier, or give people a model. Yeah, Aaron, yeah, authenticity, right? I mean, that's behavior perhaps, but authenticity, depending on what you mean by that. But if you think about developing a relationship, for example, one of our webinars, and it's actually one of the most watched, we did years ago, it was maybe the second or third one in our webinar list of relationships as valuable accomplishments. And, in that context, you begin to understand what of a particular kind, what a good relationship would be. What are the criteria for good relationship with your boss, with your peer, with your significant other, with somebody you're training? What are the characteristics that make it more likely to be a successful thing? And authenticity is a way you would behave to produce perhaps a trusting relationship, that kind of thing. I'm looking at Holly's thing again. Yeah, no kidding. The discrepancies. what Holly's saying there, many performance discrepancies we find in our work are related to criteria not being defined or clearly communicated. I think that makes it clear that criteria really are ultimately about box one, expectations, if you go to the 6 boxes model. And I have yet to see a performance gap where, unclear expectations wasn't at least an opportunity to improve. I really like that point, Scott, that in many cases, we don't define them. They exist, and we're trying to pull them out. Now, that's not always true, but it sort of is it's a very interesting point. And that's, we have this inductive approach, and I go back to the sales proposal example, because I really did discover this in working with salespeople at Dun Bradstreet years ago. We were trying to help people produce sales proposals that were better. And of course, ultimately, a good sales proposal is the one that sells the deal. But there's a lot of other factors beyond the proposal itself which might affect that. Did the client have the budget? Were they, there's a whole bunch of things beside the proposal that might make a difference. So what we did as one part of developing this proposal guide was we had people pull out a bunch of examples of proposals that sold the deal and everybody agreed looked good and read well and they liked them, and then some other ones that maybe weren't so successful or they didn't like or whatever, and we sort of made a couple of 2 piles. And then it is kind of tribal knowledge, because people knew what they liked and didn't like. But we had to compare these things to actually determine what the characteristics were that seemed to make the difference. So I think that's a really important one. Anyway, we could go on. I really appreciate the fact that people are making comments in the chat box. I often have a hard time getting folks to do it, but you guys really kicked in, and I appreciate it. Any other questions or thoughts about this topic? Because we can certainly wrap up a few minutes early. Well, I appreciate your comments a lot. And so there's just a couple more things I wanted to show you. One is our open performance thinking practitioner program. The next one is scheduled in January. We do about 3 a year. And we do them in big companies too, internally, of course. We just finished, or we're in the process of finishing one for FedEx office, and some big companies bring us in. But of course, this is an opportunity for 1 or 2 people at a time to sign up, and they're groups, often really interesting combinations of people from a lot of different companies. And so our next one starts in January. We don't have it filled yet, and so I'd really like to encourage you all to reach out to colleagues and friends who might be interested in. One thought we've had recently, and I don't think people in this group are necessarily the audience for this message so much, but what we've noticed is that sometimes there are people like chief operating officers or senior leaders or heads of departments who have somebody who's kind of their sidekick or their most important assistant or one of their best people. And it could be very valuable to people in that kind of a role to put somebody through this practitioner program so they have a very systematic approach to improving the performance of their department, of their organization, of their people. And that person would be kind of a specialist. And it would also be a nice reward for that. So anyway, spread the word. We'd love to have more people in the open program in January. We're creating these free webinar study guides. If you want to get on the list, there's a QR code. We're going to get back to this in the next month or so, starting to crank out some new ones. And then we have a new thing. You can see my silly face there. The Father Carl, as my sister calls that picture of me. But we have been experimenting with accomplishment-based executive coaching now for probably 6 or 7 years. And we discovered it originally in a large behavioral health organization where the CEO asked us to do some work with her. And we found that if we did what we call an individual performance map, or what we've historically called a customer diagram, with that senior leader, that we could unpack things for them and help them see their own jobs in new and important ways, really, that might cause them to delegate things, might cause them to reallocate their time and energy, might cause them to look at the processes that they were involved in, and so forth. And so it's a distinctly new thing that we kind of discovered. And we were, before COVID happened, going to have a long certification weekend for existing executive coaches to give them this new toolkit. And then COVID hit and we didn't do it. So about a month or 6 weeks ago, I said, wait a minute, we've been experimenting with this now on and off, informally and with a few clients for years. Let's make it more publicly available. And so, I'm available for this executive coaching, and the first session is free. But I also think that a bunch of you, we're going to get to certification sometime in the next couple quarters. So, and it would just be a weekend thing. If you already know how to do performance maps of individuals, you'll have a leg up on it. But anyway, we've kicked this off, and if people are interested, they can find out more at that link or with that QR code. And then another thing, and this is just sort of advance notice, something that we really discovered this during COVID, because prior to COVID, we had clients, at least one of whom is in this group, our colleagues, affiliates, who said, is there a less expensive way to start to learn this stuff than being certified as a practitioner or going through our coaching program? And my position on that was always that I did not want to teach performance thinking light, because as those of you who've sort of gone through these programs recognize, it looks simpler than it is. The models are simple, the language is straightforward, but performance is complicated. And so we didn't want to have kind of an overview program about performance thinking where people say, oh, I can do that, and then they'd go off and wouldn't really be able to fully leverage the methodology. But during COVID, when we started these webinars, what I began to realize is that there's a bunch of specific applications of performance, of our approach, performance thinking, that we can template. We can show you how to create an employee engagement plan for your team, whether or not you can do full performance analysis. We can show you how to look at the processes in your department and make them more measurable and easy to improve by being sure there are outputs in them. We can enable you to build better strategic plans by being sure that your objectives are accomplishments and so forth. So what we're planning to do, and we're in the process of developing the first one, and we're actually going to pilot the essentials of it at Holly's organization. We're building these application kits, which are going to be very inexpensive, essentially PDF documents with short instructional videos, series of them that go with them, that will be very inexpensive, sort of like a moderately expensive professional book that we're going to try to make available. And our hope is to get to a much larger audience, because it will be a cheap offering and it will be sample applications that people can actually do without being full-on performance thinkers. So those are coming, and I just am starting to let people know about that. And we'll certainly keep everybody up to date as they emerge. And then, if you want more information, these are the sites where you can get a lot more free information. So any final comments from anyone? Questions, thoughts, requests for the future? I sure do appreciate everybody's comments in the chat box. Alrighty then, I think we're done. So I'm going to end this session, and I really appreciate your participation. So take care. And we will be skipping November, but probably almost everybody here has missed at least one of the webinars. So you can go to performancethinking.tv and entertain yourself with one of them or more. And in December, we're going to do another one. So thanks, everybody.